Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places is the 17th episode of the second season of Wings, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I talk about this episode and share some thoughts along the way. This is definitely not my favourite episode, but that being said, there is nothing about it that didn't work. There were a couple of good moments as well. I particularly liked Roy in this episode. So I will talk through things kind of chronologically, but I might group certain aspects together. And it starts off with for me, the most embarrassing thing ever. Because Brian is doing a crossword. And he asks Lowell for a 6-letter word for duck. And my first immediate thought was mallard. Which doesn't fit, I know that. And had I had a second longer to think about it, I would have come to that conclusion. But Lowell said the exact same thing just after I thought about it, which was just the most awkward thing ever. I rather enjoyed that introduction. We then have the main narrative established, and that's the fact that this is Valentine's Day and various people have various dates. Roy has a date, and he's rather looking forward to that. He ends up going to the restaurant with his date, and he's so convinced, and this is kind of a shame really, because he's so convinced that this woman could not possibly have an interest in him because she's beautiful and he thinks he isn't attractive, that he keeps trying to find something wrong with her. And yes, it is funny, there's definitely a lot of entertainment there, but it's also quite a shame that Roy was trying to find something wrong with her because he just could not believe she would agree to this date with him. So I kind of enjoyed that part of it. He was also at the restaurant where Helen was at, but I'll talk more about Helen in a moment. Brian also gets a date with a woman called Stephanie, and there is this very, kind of awkward moment. I don't really think it was something they thought too much about, but Brian has to leave the airport at some point, and I'll come back to that in a bit why. But it's late at night, it's just Brian and Stephanie there, and he has to leave. It's in darkness, and he tells Stephanie he'll be right back. I don't think it's a good idea to leave somebody you've just met in the airport completely on their own. I feel like that's a recipe for disaster. Am I thinking too much into it? Probably. But it is something that just stood out to me immediately, so I thought that was worthy of note. The main focus of the episode is on Helen and Joe, and it actually starts out with Joe giving Helen this giant heart-shaped box of chocolates, and Helen kind of loses her mind on him, and she doesn't immediately tell Joe why this is, but we learn when Faye kind of scolds Helen for her attitude that it's because, as we know, Helen has had a lot of issues with food, and she thought it was very insensitive for Joe to give her chocolates. And on the one hand, yes, I can kind of see that, and Brian made the connection straight away, so why didn't Joe? But at the same time, unless Helen has specifically said, I'm still struggling with this, please don't give me chocolates, I don't really think Joe did anything wrong. As Faye pointed out, his heart was definitely in the right place, and I don't think it's fair for her to have reacted the way she did. And to be honest, she also kind of comes to that conclusion. They agree to meet. She sends a Valentine's note to meet Joe in their special place. And as soon as I heard the words, meet me in our special place, I kind of knew what was going to happen next. I should point out that I have seen this episode before. I couldn't remember the specifics, and I didn't remember how the rest of this episode played out. But as I said, as soon as I heard those particular words, I had a feeling I knew what was going to happen next, and I was right. It turns out Joe's special place and Helen's special place are not the same thing. Helen goes to the restaurant, Joe goes up to where they first had their first kiss, and a lot of it is them waiting around for the other person, and Roy helped Helen to realise once his date had left that Joe's special place was somewhere else. And then Joe arrives at the restaurant and Helen has left, and there's a lot of going back and forth. It gets a little bit repetitive, and I think that's part of the reason why I didn't completely love it. But that being said, there are some interesting parts to it as well. Specifically, what I thought was interesting was the way Joe was behaving, because Joe is characteristically quite uptight, but we see him being quite drunk, not out of his mind drunk, but happy drunk. And it's a side of Joe that we don't get to see basically ever. So that was quite nice. It was a little bit different to see him relaxed but not too drunk. And I rather enjoyed that. So it's a decent episode. I certainly don't mind it. It's never ever going to be my favourite. But that being said, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing I think should have been done differently. And ultimately, it's a pretty good episode. And I wouldn't skip it. I definitely wouldn't skip it if I'm watching season 3 again. I doubt I'd choose it, but at the same time, I think I'd rather enjoy it again. Definitely not a bad episode at all.